Good afternoon. I am Michele Cobb, the publisher of AudioFile magazine, which is the #1 source for audiobook reviews in the world. And I'm very excited today. We're here to talk about Jane Austen and our Audiobook Break podcast. And that is season 3 of Audiobook Break. It is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, narrated by Alison Larkin. So I will tell you today, we were supposed to bring together Caroline Jane Knight and Alison Larkin to talk about this wonderful piece that was put together. And unfortunately, Alison is on an airplane right now because she has had a death in the family. So she will not be able to join us, but we will have a vigorous conversation without her, and her spirit is amongst us. And I hope you will join me in sending her warm thoughts and good wishes. Now, we will be taking your questions, so please be sure to put those in the Q&A box, not the chat box, so that I can actually see them. All right, so as we said, Pride and Prejudice was narrated by Alison Larkin. We'll read her bio because she's amongst us in spirit here. She's a writer and comedian who has appeared on Broadway, and she's the award-winning narrator of more than 200 audiobooks and the best-selling author of The English American, a novel. She really does it all. In 2017, she founded Alison Larkin Presents, which is a unique independent audiobook company based in the Berkshires. And to date, her company has received 11 AudioFile Earphones Awards for Alison herself and many of the narrators she has produced or directed. And her new solo show, Grief, the Musical, a comedy, will be premiering in June. There is a scene about audiobooks, about an audiobook studio in the show, and Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy are mentioned in one of the songs. And our next guest is, in fact, the 5th great niece of legendary author Jane Austen, and she's the last of Jane's nieces to be raised in the family's ancestral home in Chawton, England, where Jane herself lived and wrote her most famous works, of course. Caroline was appointed CEO of and this is why I'm not an audiobook narrator, because it's very hard for me to read these things, Demo Plus in 2009, which took her to Australia, and the worldwide celebrations of the 200th anniversary of Pride and Prejudice in 2013 inspired her to establish the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation to harness the passion for Jane Austen and support the practice of literacy across the world. All right, I will remind you that this is a recorded conversation, and it will be up on our YouTube channel within about a week. So we encourage you to send your friends and family who are not able to attend today to our YouTube channel to check it out. All right. And finally, our podcasts. You can hear us review audiobooks every weekday on Behind the Mic. And since its launch in February, which was Valentine's Day, of course, season 3 of Audiobook Break has been delighting both new and devoted Jane Austen fans everywhere, as we've been listening to Pride and Prejudice, narrated by Alison Larkin. So let's hear from our guest today about the process, about all of her background, and she can tell us little tidbits about Jane, of course, as well. All right. Hi there and welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It's great to be here. And I'm curious, because obviously you have had such an interesting background and experience with Jane. Can you tell us a little bit about your family history, the house, and of course, the power of audiobooks? Because we're here talking about audiobooks, and we've chosen to take Pride and Prejudice, break it up into various chapters, and make it available as a podcast. So that was a lot. Let's start with your family history in the house. As
you said, let's start with the history. Absolutely. So as you obviously know, my surname is Knight, and the Austens and the Knights are cousins, were cousins years and years and years ago. And the Knight family actually built this grand sort of English manor in Chawton around 1588. The Knight family built the house. Nice. And it has never been sold. The freehold of the house has never been sold. It's been passed down from generation to generation through the Knight family. And I'm 17th generation to have lived and grown up at Chawton House. Now, in actual fact, over 17 generations, it's not an unbroken bloodline, because in practice, obviously before fertility treatments and other things like that, if people couldn't have children, they couldn't have children. And in our family, because we're on our 16th squire now, out of 16 owners, 8 times the squire hasn't had children. Wow. So 50% of the time, there actually hasn't been children there hasn't been an heir. And there has to be an heir. I mean, all of the family, it was important, centuries ago to keep all the family wealth together, to actually retain the power of your family in England. Hence why it all went to one person and the custodian of your family's, wealth and estates. And at the end of the 18th century, Thomas Knight didn't have an heir, Thomas and Catherine. And what you did was you chose a cousin or a relation or somebody who would become the heir and carry on the family's fortunes. And Thomas chose Edward Austen, who was Jane's older brother. And as I said, that the Austens and the Knights were cousins. It was actually the Knights that owned Steventon, where Jane was born, and they'd given Jane's father the job, the rectorate, the rectory at Steventon, which in those days was a gift because it came with an income and it was a way of supporting a family. So the families were close anyway. And as I said, Edward was chosen as the heir. So that meant that when he inherited, Edward actually became very rich, and he owned 3 grand estates of Godmersham Park, Chawton and Steventon. Over the years, so when he then had inherited, by this point, Jane's father had died, and Jane and her mother and sister were actually living with brother Frank down in Southampton in very, very small shared accommodation. So Edward was able to offer his mother and his sisters accommodation, a cottage, a house on one of his estates, and they chose Chawton. So in Chawton, we've got the big house, as it were, Chawton House, which is where I grew up and spent the first 18 years of my life. And in the grounds of the house, as it were, in the village, sort of 400 metres away, is Jane Austen's house, which is the cottage that the ladies moved into. And that's where all the books were written, in the cottage. But obviously, just up the road is their brothers, they're part of the estate. So they were at Chawton House all the time. I mean, that was an incredibly familiar place to Jane. There's a nook in one of the rooms where we know that she used to like to write. She would have had dinner there all the time, used the family library, the same library that I was looking at as a child. And I had the phenomenal privilege of eating from the same dining room table as her, and using the same china, and as I said, enjoying the same walks, and enjoying looking around the house, because Chawton House itself is a labyrinth of corridors and passageways, and it's a fascinating and very easy to get lost. And it's, as a kid, and I certainly know when the Austens first came to Chawton, excuse me, Fanny Austen, who became Fanny Knight, because the reason that we're Knights is that Edward Austen had to change his name to Knight as a condition of the inheritance.
Interesting.
And that's how you keep the same name. So the illusion that we're 17 generations of Knights isn't actually true. It's actually quite a convoluted path through different cousins, but always changing their name to Knight, as I said, to retain the name. Otherwise, I'd be an Austen. Otherwise, my name would be Austen, because I'm Edward Austen's 4th great-granddaughter. And Jane herself had no children. So there are no direct descendants of Jane Austen's. But there are collateral descendants, which is what I am, which means that we're descended from her brothers and sisters. And there are, because she was one of a large family, and some of her brothers and sisters, her brothers certainly had large families, and they went on to have large families. So there's actually quite a lot of people. The family tree actually expands quite rapidly. And then 2,500 people, according to Ancestry.com, alive today that have the same blood relationship to Jane that I do, which is being I'm a 5th great niece. But obviously, where I have to say, I'm just so fortunate and so lucky, is because, as I said, I am product of the eldest son passing to the eldest son, passing to the eldest son, and my grandfather was squire when I was born, that I got to spend the first 18 years of my life at Chawton. And not only, of course, I can't describe the privilege of growing up in 400 years of your own family history. You know, every single thing that I can see, as far as the eye can see, has been put there by a member of my family. That, you know, every tree's been planted, you know, by the family. That's an incredible place to grow up in terms of, you know, a sense of belonging and where I come from and that sort of thing. I would hasten to add that the money had run out decades before I was born. I mean, there's so many, sorry, at the end, you know, we're now in the 19th century, death taxes, estate duties and things were brought in deliberately to redistribute the wealth in England. And that was the right thing to do. I mean, the wealth was, you know, concentrated into a few families in comparison, obviously, to the population. But of course, over time, that means that the wealth, every time the squire dies and the estates pass on to the next generation, enormous amounts of taxes have to be paid and death duties over the years. So that just depleted that and other pressures, but that just absolutely depleted the family fortune, as it did for most, you know, yes, for most families of our sort of, you know, the landed gentry is what we are, as opposed to aristocracy, if you know what I mean. So there's no lords, we're not aristocracy, we're the landed gentry, which is what Jane wrote about. You know, that's what Darcy is, that's, you know, that's what Bingley is, we're landed gentry. And it's a similar sort of property, if you know what I mean. If you were to sort of pick the sorts of houses they would have lived in, that's sort of what Chawton House is. And in my childhood, Chawton House was, I mean, we were open during the summer. So we had, Granny actually ran a tea room from the great hall at the front of the house, partly because I think she loved, I mean, she was just a fantastic cook and loved baking and all those sorts of things. But now I'm an adult looking back, I think it was probably also financial, you know, it brought in some income and the bills needed to be paid. I mean, it really was that simple. And I earned my pocket money as a child working in that tea room. So I actually spent my childhood, you know, every weekend during the summer, talking to Jane Austen fans, talking to different people who obviously wouldn't have ever expected that it would actually be her family working in the tea room. I mean, obviously people's perception of a family like us and the financial situation is very different from the reality. So yes, Jane Austen was, I mean, not only as a member of our family and how incredibly proud we are of her and her legacy, but she was an everyday, you know, people were talking about her. She was obviously she was of course why people were coming. It wasn't to see us. And we used to, as children, have a little bit of fun with it. You know, I used to love when, you know, I'd go up with my pad and paper to take someone's order, you know, having seated them at a table in the Great Hall, and they'd sort of say, are the Knight family in today? And you'd sort of grandly go, yes, we are, in a sort of, you know, you know, and sort of enjoy the looks on people's faces. And the house was also used, because it had been traditionally for years, for events every year. So every year, the Jane Austen Society of the UK have their AGM there. So that's about 500 people used to come, and a massive marquee every year. And that was great fun, again, as children. There's also the annual fete and horticultural show and the Christmas Carol service. And so, you know, the sorts of events that in a village structure like that, the big house was used for some village events, and that tradition very much carried on. So we also had, you know, there was always something to prepare for. There was always something going on. You know, Granny was always baking for something, and you know, my dad or my uncle would always be mowing the lawns or putting cones out down the front drive or whatever it was to get ready for the next event. So it was a very, very busy, lively family home, but as I said, with of course the incredible legacy of Jane Austen with it as well.
It sounds like you recognized that really early on as a very young person, that you're living in this history and that you're participating in it as well.
Yes, I did, but at the same time, of course, it was normal. I mean, to any kid, their environment is normal. I knew it wasn't normal, because on the respect of, yes, of course, I was very well aware. I mean, I didn't have a first day of discovering Jane Austen. I mean, I've known Jane Austen since the day I was born. I you know, as a babe in arms, you know, we were, I mean, obviously her cottage is in the middle of the village, and that brings tens of thousands of visitors to the village every year. So yes, she's always been a big presence. And I mean, as I said, of course, I knew things. I knew my upbringing was unusual. I mean, apart from anything, because the fortune had long run out. Whilst I'm very well educated and I'm not complaining, you know, we weren't at expensive, the poshest public schools in England. We weren't at, if you know what I mean. I went to Chawton Primary School.
Right.
So you know, of course, in terms of my friends and my peers at school and things like that, of course, no one else lived in a house like I did. No one else had that. So of course I knew that it wasn't completely normal, but at the end of the day, you know what you've lived, don't you, as a child?
That's true, but you also must have come into, you know, experiencing her words maybe earlier than most people.
Oh, absolutely, and certainly Lizzie and Darcy. Again, I don't remember the first day I heard about them. I mean, they were of course the first names that you know, visitors would sort of say. And I do remember. I mean, I have to say, as a young child, I wasn't particularly engaged in Jane's work. So I did. I mean, I remember asking Mum. I mean, let's just say I was 5 or 6. You know, what all the fuss was about in terms of Darcy, because people used to mention him so much, you know, and you know, her trying to explain to a 6-year-old why this sort of seemingly moody, standoffish man was actually the hero of the novel made no sense to me at all. And I think I actually tried. Well, no, I did. I tried to read it when I was about 9, and I just wasn't. I wasn't. I mean, I spent my childhood running around the state, having fun, you know, getting ready for things, climbing trees, investigating the attics that were full of, you know, old parchments and old clothes and just, you know, centuries of family stuff to have fun with. So I didn't spend an awful lot of my time as a young child reading. And I tried. I mean, I read Enid Blyton and things like that, but it wasn't. You know, do you know what I mean? I had a lot of other things to do. And I remember trying Pride and Prejudice when I was about 9 and just couldn't get the language, couldn't engage with it in that way. And then I read it again when I was about 16. And I'd known my whole childhood that when my grandfather died, this 400 years of Chawton House was coming to an end. I knew that we as a family would not be able to keep Chawton House as a family home. And I'd always been told that was never hidden, you know, so that, and that was something that, you know, I'm obviously, and I was at the time, and I remember thinking at the time, I hope I get my childhood here. You know, I hope that I get my childhood, and I got to 18. So I did get my childhood. But when I read Pride and Prejudice fully and properly, when I was 15, probably actually 15, you know, I knew that the day was coming. And I knew that my dad's older brother, Richard, was going to inherit. He's the eldest son, and I knew that he was the heir. And Richard's absolutely lovely man. But Richard didn't live at the house because he was my grandfather's son from a first marriage. Mm-hmm. And that marriage had ended quite quickly. And then my grandparents had got together and had lots of children between them. So Richard, as said, was a half older brother, but a half brother. And as I said, he's an absolutely lovely man. But we had the peculiarity of our house was still under an entail. It was entailed to Richard, who didn't live there, and we did. So when I read Pride and Prejudice, I have to say, I didn't really pay much attention to Lizzie and Darcy at the time. It was Mr. Collins and Mrs. Bennet and that dynamic, you know, and the whole issue of course, the house being entailed and what was going to become of them. And at the time, that was actually what my life concerns were about, was actually what was going to happen when my grandfather died. And, you know, because the trying to imagine not being there and it not being our family home was impossible. So we left when I was 18, and at this point, something else I should probably throw into the story is that I mean, I've sort of said one of the interesting things we had to manage as kids was the perception of wealth and how wrong that was to the reality. But the other thing was that my father and my brother are dyslexic, and we didn't know at the beginning what the problem was. But we were living in a Jane Austen mecca, where, of course, all of these terribly well-read academics are coming, and people that, yes. And yet, actually, the reality in our house was that half the people couldn't read very well, or certainly the men couldn't read very well. And that actually created an environment where, whilst, of course, yes, my mum and my gran read, it was something that, we weren't sitting around the fireplace on a Sunday afternoon reading Jane Austen to each other. That wasn't happening. And sometimes people are terribly disappointed and think that would have been the reality, but it wasn't. And in actual fact, so we actually had to leave Chawton when I was 18. And Richard inherited and actually inherited quite a challenge of what to do with a property that by this point actually needed a lot of money spending on it. I had no perception of that as a child. It's a phenomenally grand place with oak paneling, and it's just wonderful. But I had no sense, I had no idea it needed so much doing to it. So it has since been, it's no longer a residential home. It's been completely restored now as a public building, which is a different thing to have a public building as opposed to a private family home in terms of, fire exits and compliance and sort of what it needs. So it said it needed a lot doing to it. And it's now open to the public, which is fantastic. It's a visitor centre, and it has an amazing collection of early women's writing from 1600 to 1830. Anyway, in the meantime, business has brought me over here to Australia, and I've been in Australia now for 15 years. And as I said, when I was a child, my dad particularly couldn't read and write very well at all, and didn't really interact with literature very much, because how could he? And actually, one of the most, I can't tell you what an absolute delight it's been for me in the last decade to see audiobooks change his life in terms of his, both obviously because his own heritage is so heavily wrapped up in literature, because audiobooks for Dad and have given him a way into literature. And he started by listening to Jane Austen's audiobooks, and Alison was absolutely his favourite narrator of Austen's work. I'd never met Alison, I didn't know anything about her. But I remember one trip home, and all of a sudden, Dad was actually joining in. We were in Chawton, and somebody was talking about Jane's work. And he actually was joining in, and talking about, oh, no, that's not what it says in Emma. And he's actually having a very informed conversation about the specifics of what is in Emma, that particular conversation was about. And I just couldn't believe it. It was just extraordinary. And having listened to the audiobooks, he's then read the original text. It gave him, enough confidence and enough knowledge of what the story is and what the text is, having heard someone else read it, because obviously someone else is interpreting it, aren't they? And Austen does have a lot of very long sentences, and someone else's narration breaks that down into something that's obviously completely understandable, isn't it? Right. Now that has now led him on to, he's listened to Dickens, he's listened to all the classics, and it has, as I said, audiobooks have absolutely revolutionized his relationship with literature, his ability to read the classics, but it has for him also revolutionized, I think, his relationship with his own heritage, because it's something, that he's actually got firsthand now, the magic and why Jane is so popular, which of course it's something that I think before he was always incredibly proud of it, but didn't really understand for himself what the magic was. And it's absolutely done that. And so I actually wrote a book in 2017, or published in 2017, called Jane and Me, My Austen Heritage.
Yes.
We'll talk about growing up in the house and try and give people a sort of sense of what that life was about, and then talk about losing it and sort of what's happened since. And because of Dad, I wanted it to be an audiobook on the day it was released. I wanted my dad and my brother to be able to listen to it, straight away, easily. And so I phoned Dad and talked about it, and he immediately said, Alison Larkin, get Alison Larkin to do it.
Wow.
So I do as I'm told. So I got in touch with Alison Larkin, and she'd actually met Dad in Chawton the previous year.
Really?
She had gone to Chawton purely as a visitor, and Dad works as a volunteer guide there. which he loves, and so they ended up talking and having a chat anyway. So I contacted Alison, and she thankfully said, "Gosh, of course you would, of course you would." So I had the pleasure of having her record my book as an audiobook, as I said, because she's absolutely Dad's favourite narrator. And yeah, so that's how Alison and I sort of ended up meeting. But that was 5-6 years ago. And that has, I have to say, led on to a great friendship between Alison and I. And she is now, and she's become an ambassador for the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation, which is, yes, the organisation I set up in 2013. So she's now an ambassador for that. And we actually have an annual writing competition, a short story writing competition. And the prize for our writing competition is the 3 short stories, the winning stories. Alison actually records them as an audiobook, and we publish every year. So the winners get their work done by Alison. So yes, it all comes full circle.
I get that. That's amazing. Now, there's a lot of questions for you before we go on to ask some of the other things that I have. I want to get to some of these questions that are in the chat because they deal with your family history. And the first thing people want to know is, do you have any of Jane's possessions?
Right. So in terms of personal possessions of Jane's, no. No, we don't have the missing diary, unfortunately. If only. We don't have the missing diary. And no, we don't have, as I said, her personal possessions, which were actually quite few. Yes. I mean, they weren't wealthy. So things like her jewelry and things is actually in the cottage, in Jane Austen's cottage, which is a museum. But we do have things like, so in 1813, Jane went to London, and she went with Edward to Wedgwood, and they chose a dinner service to be made for the family, which has got our family crest on it. And Jane actually she wrote to Cassandra that night, and that letter has survived. And she writes about going to Wedgwood, and she actually describes the pattern of purple in gold bands. Well, that dinner service, so she ate from that when she was at Chawton House having dinner, and that survived. And my parents own that. They got that as a wedding present from my grandfather. So I have to say, we hardly use it at all anymore. Hardly at all. When I was a child, we did, for big dinner party, for the real, you know what I mean, special events, we'd use it, but not anymore. It's all, safe now.
And does the family have any of her letters?
Not in our possession. There's a lot in Chawton. There are some in the house in Chawton. Anything, I was supposed to be blunt about it, anything that was worth money would have been sold.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Absolutely. Because as I said, my from a financial perspective, we probably should have left Chawton, I don't know, in the 1940s or 50s. But thankfully for me, my grandfather didn't want to, and was pretty stubborn about that. And so, to pay the bills, unfortunately, things were sold.
Yes. Well, thankfully for all of us, because we get to hear these amazing stories.
Well, and who knows what would have happened to Chawton? Because Jane Austen then didn't have the sort of, obviously Jane Austen, when I was a child, so I grew up in Chawton House before Colin Firth. So we're pre-Colin Firth, and you can draw a line in Jane Austen's sort of, the fandom of Jane Austen, absolutely draw a line at Colin Firth. So we're pre-Colin, which means that she was incredibly popular and famous, but the people that used to visit were academics or people that loved reading classical literature. So people that read her text firsthand. Now, of course, there's still an awful lot of those people visit, but you've also got, an enormous population of people who obviously love Austen through films and probably have read one or two of her books, but have probably come to it through film and television series. And that, as I said, that all really ballooned after 95.
And so do you personally have a favorite film or theater adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, for instance? We've stumped her.
Well, it's certainly, because it's always a difficult question, because I think it always depends on what things are being judged. Yes. And I would say on how things are being judged. And I would say right here, right now, that I absolutely celebrate all the versions, if you know what I mean. I'm not remotely, you know, and I know that sometimes versions come out that people don't like, and some people can get terribly upset about that. And I do get people contacting me saying the latest whatever's awful, what are you going to do about it?
Wow, that's a lot of pressure.
Exactly, which I can't really do much about it. And I think if I was going to spend my time getting having an opinion or getting upset by what people are doing with Jane's work, I'd be upset all the time, wouldn't I? If you know what I mean. You know, her work is just so widely used in so many different ways that it's just, you know, so I celebrate it all. On a personal level, whilst I think that the 95 Pride and Prejudice obviously is an absolute standout adaptation, and it is a standout adaptation. For me personally, and I don't know if it's a controversial thing to say, but I still don't think, whilst it is absolutely brilliant as a production and changed Austen's fortunes in the modern world, in today's world, it still for me doesn't necessarily bring out what's at the heart of Pride and Prejudice enough, but it could be that because we all have slightly different perceptions, which is the wonder of Jane's work, isn't it? Right. Because as I said, for me, Pride and Prejudice, the grittiness of the reality that they're actually in, of their circumstances. And I probably sometimes get a little bit protective of Mrs. Bennet and of her being treated as in such a, of her being ridiculed so much by the way that she's sometimes interpreted. And actually in the 95 one, she's not interpreted badly at all. There are other versions which really paint her to be a ridiculous character. And that's something that I think, Pride and Prejudice is a dual story. You've got this beautiful love story happening, of course you have, but you've also got, as I said, what underlies that is actually the greater reality of the time that they were living in, the challenges that women face, the challenges around inheritance, the challenge, and Mrs. Bennet's concern about what was going to happen to them all and those sorts of things was totally valid and real. And so I would love to see, I said 95 would absolutely, be my favorite production, but I would love to see Pride and Prejudice also done in a way that, as I said, focuses on that aspect as well.
Well, I think you've put a challenge out there in the world to all the film and television makers right there.
Exactly.
So we had a couple more questions. One of the questions was, you do a fundraiser. Would the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation be hosting a tea party this year?
Yeah, so we do. I mean, so the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation, our mission is to connect through literacy. And we sort of have three different streams of work, if you like. One is that we run online literacy activities to connect our community, so we're doing a writing competition now. We do Literacy Month in September and usually do a 30-day challenge, that sort of thing. So things that we can all participate in on social media and join in together. We do those sorts of things. We have volunteer programs, so people can volunteer their time to become a literacy mentor, 2 hours a month from home on your laptop. But that's people, because one of the most amazing things about the Jane Austen community, and I have to say, I can't think of anybody it's a luck of birth for me, and I can't think of anybody I would have picked over her to be related to and to have the opportunity, as I said, to do something in her name, because the Jane Austen community is full of pretty well educated, teachers, writers, and people that are incredibly generous in their spirit. So we have, so actually getting people to, participate and give a bit of time and things. These are really, highly educated, as I said, people. So actually 2 hours a month of someone's time reading some children's work and giving them some constructive feedback and those sorts of things is really, really powerful and actually makes a massive difference to a child. And then the third stream, as you said, is fundraising. So we've got lots of fundraising activities. I think the one you're talking about is Jane Austen Tea for Literacy. Yes. And that runs every sort of November through to December 16th through to Jane's birthday. And people register and download a pack with, I've done lots of our traditional family recipes from Jane's time, because we've still got all of our family cookbooks. So I've picked some of the cakes and things from Chawton that Jane would have been eating and done some recipes for people. And there's a Jane Austen games pack and things. So yes, we launched that last year and had a great success, and tea parties going on around the world raising money. And because we're an organisation that is 100% run by volunteers, I'm a volunteer, all of us are volunteers, and there's probably about 400 people involved across the world now. Wow. Across 29 countries. But because we're all volunteers, 100% of the donations are spent on literacy projects. We don't take 1 cent out for management or wages or anything like that. So everything we raise goes directly to literacy, and we pay for, we have just funded our 5th school in India to participate, to have a literacy program called Read to Kids, to have that fully sort of executed in the schools, which makes a massive difference. We pay for lots of Indigenous children here in Australia in the remote communities. There's literacy issues there. We've paid for projects in Syria and Ghana. So yes, that's what we do.
Now, I see someone wants to know, you talked about the short stories that are written and are recorded by Alison. How does one obtain those? Where can one listen to them?
Well, interestingly enough, they're actually currently, because we're now in our 3rd year, the first 2 are actually available on Audible. So you can actually just buy them from Audible. They're not very expensive because they're obviously short books. You can just buy them on Audible. Now from this year, however, we have actually changed slightly how we're going to do it, and we're actually just going to release them as a podcast so that everybody can listen to them. We've slightly sort of changed how we're going to do it, and then because we sort of thought doing them on Audible, we'll be able to raise some money, and we will, and we do, but we've actually sort of decided that it's much better if everybody could hear them. And then what we'll do at sort of year 5, when we've got 15 short stories, is that's the time to obviously put them into one and have them on Audible as a book to sell. So very soon they will all be available as a podcast, and we'll obviously publicise that, and everyone can just listen to these stories.
That's fantastic. It sounds like you do some listening. I mean, outside of Jane Austen and your own book, what do you like to listen to the most?
I actually now in my life probably listen to more. I from a fiction point of view, because of all the contacts I have and I'm connected to so many writers, I have to say I tend to spend my time reading the new books of people I know. Because there's enough of them, and I'm very lucky that people send me books and things. So I'm just so that sort of keeps me relatively busy in that way. I'm also somebody. So Natalie Jenner is an author that did the Jane Austen Society, which is one of the most successful, I don't know if it's fan fiction, I suppose you'd call it, if you know what I mean. It's actually based on the Knight family in Chawton. Fiction, she's made up some characters, but so her new book's just come out, Broodly Girl, so I'm reading that at the moment. But I'm actually somebody that, because I also run a business, I have to say I spend a lot of my time, if I'm consuming stuff, it tends to be non-fiction. You know what I mean? I'm often listening to, stuff that will help me in business.
And does your dad still do a lot of listening?
Absolutely. So we're both people that are very creative, and so I've got an art studio out in my garden, and he's got a workshop at home, and I know that when he spends his hours in his workshop, that there is an audiobook on all the time. So yes, he's listening. Absolutely.
That's fantastic. We love to hear that. So Pride and Prejudice, we've done it, you did it as an audiobook, Alison did, and now we've got the podcast. What do you think? What does the increased access, even for a short period, make you happy? I mean, what do you like people to know about the difference between the audiobook and the podcast?
I mean, I personally think there's something, and I try and resist binge watching stuff. Nowadays it's all about Netflix, isn't it? Just releasing everything in one go, and you spend one afternoon, you've watched a whole series. And whilst sometimes it's irresistible and you can't do that, I do like the, just getting a bit at a time, and that is actually how, Jane's work was written with of course, people to read to themselves, but also with the idea of people reading out loud, because often, obviously, with so few people being able to read, and also there being no other forms of entertainment, you know, often the reader would be entertaining, you know, everybody else in the family or whatever by reading out chapters of something. And I do think, as I said, that there is something nice about the old-fashioned way, you know, just getting a little bit at a time. So I think the sort of, you know, podcast being released, you know, a few chapters at a time, I think still gives someone that anticipation for the next piece, doesn't it? And one of the most amazing things I think about Austen's work is the fact that, I mean, to read it yourself, they do say it's designed to be reread. It's designed that, you know, the first time you read Pride and Prejudice, you don't know that Wickham is a baddie. You don't know that. So you read it completely differently. The second time you read it, you know that. So you read, and in the second time you read it, you see all sorts of things that you didn't see the first time because you didn't know that you didn't know that piece of information. And in actual fact, the academics tell me that Austen, you need to read it 6 times to actually, you know, every time you read it, there's a different layer that you'll see. There's a different, you know, something else will come out. And I personally think that when you hear someone else read it, it gives you a whole nother perspective as well. It gives you a whole nother experience because as I said, her work is so deep. There's so many layers to it. And I certainly found that listening to, you know, Alison's recording of it, as I said, brought it alive again in another way.
So if you haven't subscribed yet to Audiobook Break, you know, it's only available for a specific period of time. So we encourage you to go now to your favorite podcast app, look for Audiobook Break, and start downloading now. And you can listen to a few chapters every day before it disappears. Someone here is saying
1,000 times.
1,000 times. Wow. That is dedication to Pride and Prejudice.
I did, so before the pandemic, obviously, I used to do a lot of speaking. So for, say, the 2 years pre-pandemic, I spoke 70 or 80 times, you know, live events in sort of various parts of the world. And it wasn't unusual when you do an event like that, and then obviously afterwards you're signing books for people that want them, and usually people, you know, are keen to get their book signed and go, but there's always sort of a few people that want to, you know, wait and have a good chat, and I'm always very happy for that. And it wasn't unusual at all for people to burst into tears. Not unusual in the slightest.
Wow.
Now that's not me. You know, this is not me. They're not, but you know, it's not. And when I spoke to those people and would sort of ask them, you know, how they first got to know Jane or whatever it is, that their story was usually had a theme to it, which was at some point when they'd been a young girl. I mean, usually we're talking about women, or maybe in their early adulthood, something had happened in their lives, maybe a you know, death in the family or whatever it was. And in that time, through serendipity or an aunt or someone put a copy of Pride and Prejudice in their hands. And in that moment, the comfort that they got from Jane's work was so extraordinary that it actually created a lifelong, and we're not just talking about, you know, joy for her work. It's a very personal connection that people feel. And they return to that work over and over and over again. And her work just has, and she just has this amazing ability through her writing to make people feel safe and comforted, and it's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary, that the depth of that relationship that people can have with Jane. And people do read Pride and Prejudice 1,000 times.
Well, don't just read it with your eyes. Go to
Absolutely.
Audiobook Break and, you know, read the podcast with your ears. The AudioFile puts together the podcast by taking the audiobook and breaking it up into sections with a little bit of an interstitial to get you in and out of it every day. And it's a really fun experience. All right. Someone wants to know, what is the relationship between you and Anna Chancellor?
Oh, so Anna Chancellor is, so we're both descended from Edward, but in the next generation, we then split. So I'm then descended from Edward's eldest son, Edward, who was also called Edward. And Anna, I think, is descended from one of the other siblings at that stage. So we would be I haven't worked it out, we'd be, you know, third cousins or something like that. So we have, I think she's a 5th grade niece as well, with the same relationship to Jane Austen, but we split off, as I said, about 3 generations ago.
And so do you ever get the full expanded family together, or for, you know, the Knights and the Austens?
We do, in terms of, I mean, obviously, yes, the full expanded family, as I said, nowadays is thousands of people,
Right.
actually, if you want to take it right back from Jane's, you know, Jane's generation. But obviously in you know, more recent times, so all of my dad's siblings and all of my cousins from there, yes, from time to time we'll have a reunion.
So someone wants to know, if there were a new adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, whom would you like to play, regardless of age?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Catherine de Bourgh. Catherine de Bourgh, every step of the way. Catherine de Bourgh.
And from your knowledge of Jane Austen, from your family history, how similar was Jane to Elizabeth Bennet?
I think that one of the many things that keeps Jane so popular is that she's an enigma. I mean, it's in amongst all of this, we actually have somebody that we don't actually know much about. We know a lot about her, but we don't know much about her all at the same time. Because, as I said, there is no diary. Of course, what we have is her work, and we can deduce what we want to from her work. And we have the surviving letters, but the letters were her writing to her sister, or her writing to such close friends that it's impossible to know what's an in-joke, what's serious, what's not. It's impossible to know. And I think it is a very dangerous pursuit when people think that they know Jane Austen. I don't know Jane Austen, if you know what I mean. Of course, I have a very strong sense of who she is, very strong sense of who she is. And I think that she certainly, it's funny, so I see traits in Elizabeth Bennet that I would absolutely equate with Jane. I mean, I think she was someone that had a very lively spirit. She had her own mind, clearly very intelligent, clearly knew what she was talented at, what she wanted to do, but she had her own opinion. She was also an awful lot of fun. I mean, there's no doubt about that, a lot of fun, and had a wicked sense of humor. And certainly my view would be on things like the letters that were burnt when she died. I don't think there was anything, I don't think that's because there was some secret romance in there that filmmakers try and suppose about. I think it was quite simply that between her and Cassandra, I think some of the things she said about people, you know, I think her wit was such that I think I think it was as simple as that. You know, I think things would have been said. So I certainly see lots of traits of Lizzie in Jane, but I still think it's dangerous to go, aha, there we are, if you know what I mean. I still think that's a dangerous game. I think there's more, you know, more to her. And the fact that we don't know, as I said, is actually part of the mystery.
I love it. Yeah.
Exactly. Because in a way, as I said, you're talking about someone that left us so much, but actually left us so little in another way. And we just don't know. We don't know what she looked like.
Right.
We don't know what she looked like. Which is tantalizing, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So here's a great question. Didn't you have a Lady Catherine outfit at Alton about 3 summers ago? Someone wants to know.
Yes, I did. So as I said, when you said who would I be, and I said Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Exactly. So it's yes. So so I actually have to say I only dress up once a year, and that is for Jane Austen Regency Week is in Chawton every year. So that's 9 days in June. So I go every June, and for the ball and things, we dress up, and I am always channeling Catherine de Bourgh. I just love I don't know why. I don't know why at all. There's a way in which, although I don't want this to sound as though my grandmother was my grandmother was an absolutely lovely woman, absolutely lovely, and loved me very much. And I had a lovely childhood with her, but I can see Catherine de Bourgh in her. I can see it. You know what I mean? That sort of my grandmother had an air of authority that was just not to be challenged. And she didn't explain herself. She didn't, and you wouldn't have dared ask. I mean, if Granny said that, you know, she wanted that done, you did it. There just wasn't a, and I admired her enormously, my grandmother. And as I said, while Catherine de Bourgh was, you know, obviously spoke to people in a way that was designed to humiliate them, my grandmother didn't do that, but, you know, just that air she had about her. So I think that's probably why I'm drawn to Catherine.
Now, people want to know, are you going to be coming to the US anytime soon for any speaking engagements?
Well, because I haven't actually spoken in the US at all.
Really?
So I've done a lot in Europe and an awful lot on this side of the world as well. But no, I haven't done the US at all yet. But 2025 is sort of ticking away in the back of my mind, because 2025 is the 250-year anniversary of her birth.
Wow, so perfect.
Exactly. So I thought, well, that's probably going to be, you know, a time when perhaps there'll be, you know, a flurry of interest. I mean, there is masses anyway, but you know what I mean? That'll be a time when, you know, the media will be looking for something to write about with Jane Austen. So I thought that's probably not a bad year to perhaps think about coming over to and doing a few events in the States.
Well, we're envisioning it for you, and I think people are ready to come and see you speak. All right, so kind of as a closing question about the podcast, you know, what's one thing that you hope listeners will be left with after hearing the podcast and hearing Pride and Prejudice?
I think there's probably two different sorts of listeners I'd answer that for. For listeners that are new to Jane's work or haven't read her work before, I, as I said, I absolutely hope that listening to it as a podcast read just so beautifully. And the brilliant thing about Alison is, because she's Alison's skill, I mean, she's got many, but one of them is her voice. And she's a chameleon. I mean, her voice, she can do, it's incredible listening to her just flip between different voices and different accents. I mean, it's incredibly acrobatic, if you know what I mean, what she can do with her voice. And so it's lovely listening to her narrate things, because you really can hear the different characters. I mean, it's very, very clear who's speaking, who's, because of the way she does it. And I think if you're new to Austen's work and haven't read her work before, listening to someone like Alison read it first, as I said, the same as it was for my father, it is a really good way in to listen to it in its original text and to just hear it in its originality. Because with Jane Austen's work, something like Pride and Prejudice, it isn't, I mean, of course, it's a fantastic story and you can see a great adaptation, and there's a few good adaptations of it, but actually listening to Jane's words is a whole different level of magic. I mean, you know, every word she uses is just so perfectly chosen. And so that, as I said, I hope that people who haven't heard her original text before will be absolutely delighted, actually, at how wonderful it is. And obviously for people that are familiar with Pride and Prejudice, as I said, there's nothing more delightful than hearing it read so well and hearing someone else's sort of take an emphasis on different bits. And as I said, broken down, even if you know Pride and Prejudice inside out, broken down, as I said, and having to wait for the next episode, there's still some excitement about that.
I love this idea you're giving everyone of the anticipation, and you know, hearing it in someone's voice, as with many things, it's a delicious experience, and then having to hold for a minute before you listen to more. Yeah, that's a great concept. All right, I will give everyone a chance to ask one last question in the Q&A box. And someone's asking, what about speaking at JASNA AGM? So
So that's the JASNA, which is the Jane Austen Society of North America, is what's being referred to there. So the Jane Austen Society of North America is the most, you know, the biggest society there is. And at last count, there are over 70 branches of the Jane Austen Society of North America. This is, and every branch is having regular, you know, meetings, and there's annual AGMs and all the rest of it. And certainly, I mean, that would be a great place to come and speak. I mean, we'll have to.
I think you're being technically invited somewhere in there.
That'd be fantastic.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, especially since it is literally the crack of dawn. We have not seen the
It's not light
sunrise
yet here
behind
in
you.
Australia. No, this is not light here.
So it's very kind of you to get up super early for us. I'd like to thank the staff of AudioFile for helping bring all this together, to Alison, who could not be here with us today, but is here with us in spirit. And of course, her voice is with us through this entirety of listening to Pride and Prejudice on the Audiobook Break podcast. I would like to thank everyone who came today. It's always great to have the questions coming in the chat box and the Q&A box, and to participate with all of our events. And of course, I'm going to remind you that this will be on replay on our YouTube channel within about a week. And of course, please go and listen to the Audiobook Break podcast. All right, before we leave, any final parting words for us?
But I tell you what, the final parting words are that if you're not already, listen to the podcast, because as I said, nobody does it as well as Alison does, in my opinion. And it's not just me, as I said, she is our family's favorite narrator of Austen's work.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your wonderful stories and background. And we've learned so much history about Jane and about your family and all of the connections and the circles with Alison as well. Thank you all very much. I'm going to stop the recording now.